This is the Cliff Yates Show. Personal growth, motivation, inspiration, and philosophies for a great life.
Hey everybody, this is the Cliff Yates Show, and today we're talking about Stoicism and the Stoic Philosophy. The first thing we need to do is differentiate what the definition of Stoic means in today's language. People refer to someone as being stoic. They're very stoic, meaning they're non-feeling. They don't show any emotions. And the Stoic philosophy is really not about that. Stoic philosophy, yes, deals with experiencing the positive emotions. And yes, they were not wanting or shutting down the negative emotions. And that became kind of a difference. They sometimes refer to that as little s Stoic, as opposed to big S Stoic or Stoicism. But let's get into the history of Stoic philosophy and Stoicism. I came across Stoicism. I was watching a podcast with Stephen Pressfield, an author, and he mentioned another author, Ryan Holiday, who is a big-time philosopher, writer, and proponent of Stoic philosophy. And as always, we give credit where credit is due and where we got our information from. So today I'm going to talk about two authors who have focused on the Stoic philosophy. Ryan Holiday is a big one. He has a YouTube channel called The Daily Stoic and a newsletter called The Daily Stoic. And he has really been part of the movement that has initiated a resurgence in this 2,500-year-old philosophy. An ancient philosophy, 2,500 years old, and I think it's fascinating to study these Stoics and what they were thinking, because now there are still writings that have survived today, and we can see what some of these philosophers were writing about and thinking 2,500 plus years ago. And it's amazing to see some of those same thoughts, ideas, and philosophies are what we are talking and thinking about today. First, I want to talk about Massimo Pugliese. I hope I'm saying that right. You can find him on YouTube also. He received a degree in philosophy, and he was studying all the philosophers, and he was looking really, he describes it himself as a midlife crisis, looking for a philosophy to study and follow. And he was looking at Aristotle and Socrates, and he liked their philosophies, but a lot of those philosophers were about wisdom, gathering knowledge, virtuous thinking, doing the right thing in the right way for the right reason. But a lot of their philosophies dealt with sticking to oneself, kind of being alone with your thoughts. And he didn't want any part of that. And then he came across the writings of Epictetus. And he thought, well, Epictetus talked about being that we are as differentiated from the animals in a couple different ways. Number one, we are a reasoning being. As human beings, we can reason, we can problem solve, number one. Number two, we are social. We can survive on our own, but we thrive socially when we're with other people. And so he liked that. He goes, okay, he could really lock onto that. So he started reading, starting with Epictetus. And really the main philosophers of Stoicism that have survived to this day are probably the most famous are Zeno, who is the founder, creator of the philosophy, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, is probably the most famous of the Stoic philosophers. But when you think about Stoicism and the people that followed it and taught it, so you have Zeno. Now, this is how it started. Zeno was a merchant. His father was a rich merchant, and he became shipwrecked and found himself walking the streets of Athens, and he wandered into a bookstore. And the bookstore owner was was doing a reading on one of the philosophers, Socrates, I believe. And so Zeno sat and listened to the talk about Socrates, the philosopher. And he got talking to the bookstore owner, and he was fascinated with this philosophy. And he asked him, where can I find one of these philosophers? And he was directed outside. There goes one right now. And that was Crates, who was, I believe, either a cynic or of the Epicurean philosophy. And he walked and talked with Crates and became a student, really, of Crates for a time until he began his own school of philosophy which started out as, it was named after him, Zenoism, I believe was the name given to the philosophy originally, and then it became Stoicism. Now, the name came because, as opposed to other schools of philosophy like Plato and these other philosophers had their own schools of philosophy that were either behind closed doors or off in a certain segregated area of Athens, the Stoic, the philosophers who started Stoicism, Zeno, and those that followed him were in the agora, right in the middle of the marketplace, and they would gather and talk and discuss in this. It was a covered porch, which was, if you translate it from the Greek, was stoa poikile, or poikile. I'm saying that wrong, but the translation meant painted porch. So stoa poikile, translated from the Greek language, painted porch, is the actual translation to English, and then it became known as Stoicism. And Zeno is the starter of that. Now, this is 300 BC, so 300 years before Christ is even born. So these philosophers, they don't know Christ, they don't know Christianity, and later they do know Christianity, but when you think about the timing, so you got Zeno, who starts Stoicism 300 BC, 300 years before Christ is even born. Now, Seneca was born the same year as Jesus. So Seneca is the same time period as Christianity is starting because Jesus is born. So definitely there wouldn't have been the New Testament, but there would have been the Old Testament. And so Seneca was, when you think about the diversity of these Stoic philosophers, first of all, they were very open to not just men being philosophers. So even BC, before Christ is even born, they're open. They felt, why can't women be just as good a philosopher as a man? So they were very open-minded to a lot of things. But you have a diverse group of people. You got Zeno, the rich merchant who his ship sank and he lost everything. And then he felt later, he made a statement saying how lucky he was that his ship sank, because he was able to now focus on philosophy. And what is philosophy? But if you translate philosophy from Greek, philo meaning love, Sophie meaning knowledge, the love of knowledge really is what philosophy means. And so all of these philosophers were just trying to do what a lot of us do today. And I think we could be called modern philosophers. How can we live a better life? How can we live happily amongst our fellow citizens? What can we do? How can we be better humans tomorrow than we were today? And that's what these philosophers would talk about and discuss. And the Stoics did it out in the open so that people could overhear or actually take part in these discussions, so that people could discuss how to get better and be better humans. And so they had this philosophy which was based really on a theme that we are human beings that can reason, and we're social beings. And they kind of had three really focuses. Really, they focused on physics, logic, and ethics. So you had those three main categories, and they really had four pillars for Stoicism. And they were courage, wisdom, temperance, and justice. So they had practical wisdom, in other words, gaining knowledge, right? Getting smarter, keep reading, keep experiencing, and courage, not to be a coward. Gain wisdom, and then have courage, which after that came justice. So courage to do the right thing, that they felt that in every situation there was a right thing to do. There was a right decision to be made. And then temperance, within reason. That's why they didn't want to deal with negative emotions. They wanted to be averse to those, to not focus on those, but they believed in the positive emotions of joy, happiness, but they didn't believe in over celebrating. So they had temperance, moderation. So, and really those things, when I was first studying Stoicism, I was at the same time my Christian walk was advancing, and I was reading the Bible, going to church, and learning more about Christianity. And I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't even be focusing on philosophy. I was loving this philosophy because it was focusing on personal excellence, and that's what Massimo Pugliese, the philosopher, that's what he liked about it. And if I wrote some notes down from what he says, because he said, what is philosophy? What is Stoic philosophy? Stoicism is a philosophy of personal betterment, personal excellence, emphasis on living reasonably and socially, providing emotional ballast against the vicissitudes of fortitude. Emotional ballast. We remain in balance based on what we have total control over and not what happens to us outside of us. So Massimo says, the main premise, live according to nature. Physics, logic, ethics. And so what Massimo Pugliese liked about the philosophy is that it was an active philosophy. In other words, there's philosophers where they call the library philosophers. They gather information, and just like a library, they put it on a shelf in their mind, but they don't do anything about it. But the Stoics, and a big reason why a lot of their writings did not survive, only from the people that quoted them and had taken notes from learning from them, because they believed in not talking about Stoicism or writing about it. They believed in doing Stoicism. They believed in living the philosophy. Their whole thing, which I totally agree with, is learn, do. Learn, do. So they were constantly putting their philosophies into action on a daily basis. They were living it. So I like the fact that their focus, and when you read about the Stoics, their whole premise really is focusing on what we have control over and not about what we don't have control over. Total focus on our thoughts, beliefs, and our actions, and everything else is we are indifferent to. In other words, it's not that they would be indifferent to wealth. It would be a preferable indifference. They would prefer to be rich, but their happiness is not going to hinge on that. And that's where we see a lot of problems today with people that think they're going to attain a certain wealth, attain a certain stature. We see actors succumb to this, thinking they get to a certain point where they've reached success, and yet there's still something missing from there. They thought that was going to be the link to their happiness, when they needed to learn to focus on what they could control and not what they couldn't control, and that they needed to happily achieve and not achieve to be happy, which I've talked about before. So Massimo Pugliese, a big time philosopher in Stoicism. And I don't think he's as well known as Ryan Holiday is. And Ryan Holiday has been asked to speak all over the country and maybe around the world about Stoic philosophy. So I was referencing earlier about the dichotomy of all these different Stoics. So we got Zeno, the merchant. He loses everything, wanders the streets of Athens, and he wanders into a bookstore, finds books or reading on Socrates or Aristotle. He's interested. He starts learning philosophy from Crates, and then he starts his own school of philosophy. And then after him was Cleanthes, was someone who studied under or with Zeno. And Cleanthes, I hope I'm saying that right. And he went on to live to be 100 years old. And he was like a water carrier by trade, and then he just studied philosophy. And then after that, there was Epictetus, who had actually been a slave. Epictetus had been a slave. He won his freedom and went on to teach Stoicism. And then you have Marcus Aurelius, who would, in his writings, now Marcus Aurelius is best known for a book called The Meditations. Meditations is an English word that we got from a Greek word that it means notes to oneself, or taking one's own thoughts down, or remembering one's own thoughts. It got translated to Meditations. These were writings that Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, would write. He's on the battlefield, and he's on the front lines, and at night he would go to his tent and he would write thoughts to himself. Ryan Holiday says that these writings were never meant to be published, and that he would have been, he would probably be upset that people even got to see these writings. But these writings were secured, passed along, and copied, and they have survived to this day, known as the Meditations, and they were thoughts to himself. And they're quite fascinating. People read Meditations, and there are several different copies of these Meditations, and some are known to be better than others. And Ryan Holiday has some of the original copies of this great book, and they say that a copy of Meditations, they say that a copy of the Meditations was smuggled into the prison and given to Nelson Mandela, and he attributed that book to him getting over his anger, and it got him through his years of incarceration. But, let me read a little bit from the book. If I'm going to suggest a book, and I'll put a link in the description here on the YouTube channel, and I'll also put a link in the description of the show notes on the podcast platforms for Ryan Holiday and his book, Lives of the Stoics. So if you have an interest in Stoicism and that ancient philosophy, and you really want to get involved in it or learn more about it, because it is a great philosophy, and it's not anti-Christian at all. But we have to remember, during that time, Zeno, who started Stoicism, was 300 years before Christ was even born. So you can't expect him or those right after him to know anything about Christianity. It is written that, of course, Seneca was the same time as Jesus, and it is written that Paul, the Apostle Paul, he came to Rome, and he actually talked to the Stoics, who were open to hear what he had to say. And actually, some of the Stoics were converted right on the spot to Christianity, and others, they weren't that open to it, except they did invite him to come back and speak to them again about this thing called Christianity. So so it's not anti-Christian. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Stoics mention God or gods in their writings, and so you could almost say that they had reasoned that there was a God before they even had access to the Bible or Christianity. they had maybe more faith than some people do today that have access to the writings of those who were with Jesus, because they reasoned that there must be a divinity, there must be a God or gods based on what they saw. They reasoned there had to be a first cause, that had to be a God. And so you find that in a lot of their writings. And maybe later on, when we get deeper into this Stoicism, and I'm going to do more episodes on this, we'll go deeper into how they actually believed in God, because they made reference to it many times in their writings. And so let me go to some writing from Lives of the Stoics by Ryan Holiday. Get the book. Buy a lot of his books. Ego is the Enemy. He's got 4 or 5 books now on Stoicism. I mean, he has immersed himself into it. I've learned so much from him, not only from his books, but also on watching his YouTube channel, The Daily Stoic. And I'll put a link for that in the description of my YouTube episode also. Let me read some of what Ryan Holiday had to say about Zeno. As Zeno left his trading days behind him, he chose a new way of living that balanced study and thought with the needs of a world driven by commerce, conquest, and technology. To Zeno, the purpose of philosophy, of virtue, was to find a smooth flow of life, to get to a place where everything we do is in harmonious accord with each man's guiding spirit and the will of the one who governs the universe. So maybe he was, right there, he's kind of making reference that he believes in God or a God, and this is 300 years before Jesus is even born. To the Greeks, each of us had a daemon, an inner genius or guiding purpose that is connected to the universal nature. Those who live by keeping the individual and universal natures in agreement are happy, Zeno said, and those who don't are not. In an effort to reach this harmony, Zeno lived a simple life, not all that different from that of his rival Epicurus, who began his school just a few years before Zeno. In an effort to reach this harmony, Zeno lived a simple life, not all that different from that of his rival Epicurus, who began his school just a few years before Zeno struck out on his own. His diet mostly consisted of bread and honey and the occasional glass of wine. He lived with the roommates and rarely hired servants. Even when he was sick, he refused attempts to spoil him or change his meager diet. He thought a later Stoic would say that someone who once experiences gourmet cuisine would want it all the time, inasmuch as the pleasure associated with drinking and eating creates in us a desire for more food and drink. Zeno's early thinking set a tone that rings true today, namely that we should consider all men and women to be of one community and one polity, and that we should have a common life and an order common to us all, even as a herd that feeds together and shares the pasturage of a common field. So that is Zeno, a little bit about Zeno, who started this philosophy called Stoicism. I find it fascinating, and I made reference earlier that I had been getting into Stoicism, reading Ryan Holiday's books, Massimo Pugliocci's, and How to Live Like a Stoic. I'll put a link to his book also in the description and the show notes. But I started reading. I was reading St. Thomas Aquinas, and I've made reference to this before, that he also, who later became a saint in the Catholic Church, he liked the philosophers, specifically Aristotle, who he called the philosopher, because he said, and I've said this before in a couple episodes before, that he said all truth is God's truth, no matter where you find it. So Stoicism, I think it's a great philosophy. It's something that really, and could be a handmaiden to Christianity. It can get you to a certain point where you can live a great life, but if you want to go a little further and there's still something that's not being fulfilled in your life, Jesus Christ can do that for us all. So, philosophy of Stoicism. It's pretty fascinating. Had a resurgence. I'm going to keep getting into it. I'm going to do more episodes on it. So let me know in the comments what you think. And if you haven't already and you're watching and or listening on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment. And if you're listening on one of the podcast platforms, subscribe to the show. Leave me a comment. You're fantastic. I love you. Subscribe, follow. Great things are coming for us all.